Socioeconomic mobility in the United States refers to the movement of Americans from one social class or economic level to another, often by changing jobs or marrying. This vertical mobility can be the change in socioeconomic status between parents and children, or over the course of a lifetime. It typically refers to relative mobility, the chance that an American's income status will rise or fall compared to others in another income status group, but can also be absolute. Whether living standards in America have increased. Belief in strong social and economic mobility, that Americans rise from humble origins to riches, has been called a civil religion, the bedrock upon which the American story has been anchored, and part of the American identity, celebrated in the lives of famous Americans such as Benjamin Franklin and Henry Ford, and in popular culture. Opinion polls show that this belief has been both stronger in the U.S. than in years past, and stronger than in other developed countries. However, in recent years several large studies have found that vertical intergenerational mobility is lower, not higher, in the U.S. than in comparable countries. Studies differ on whether social and economic mobility has gotten worse in recent years. A 2013 Brookings Institution study found income inequality was becoming more permanent, sharply reducing social mobility. A large academic study released in 2014 found income mobility has not changed appreciably in the last 20 years. Popular belief. The American Dream Report, a study of the Economic Mobility Project, found that Americans surveyed were more likely than citizens of other countries to agree with statements like "people get rewarded for intelligence" and skill. People get rewarded for their efforts, and less likely to agree with statements like "coming from a wealthy family is essential" or "very important to getting ahead." "Income differences in my country are too large," or "it is the responsibility of government to reduce differences in income." In the U.S. only 32% of respondents agreed with the statement that forces beyond the personal control determine the success. In Europe, in contrast, majorities of respondents agreed with this fatalistic view in every country but 3. The Brookings Institution found Americans surveyed had the highest belief in meritocracy. 69% agreed with the statement people are rewarded for intelligence and skill among 27 nations surveyed. Another report found such beliefs to have gotten stronger over the last few decades. Intergenerational mobility. Current state. The correlation between parents' income and the children's income in the United States is estimated between 4 and 6. If adult income had only a chance relationship to childhood circumstances, approximately 20% of children who started in the bottom quintile would remain there as adults. According to a 2012 Socio-economic mobility project study, 43% of children born into the bottom quintile remain in the bottom quintile as adults. Similarly, 40% of children raised in the top quintile will remain there as adults. Looking at larger moves, only 4% of those raised in the bottom quintile moved up to the top quintile as adults. Around twice as many children born into the top quintile fell to the bottom. 37% of children born into the top quintile will fall below the middle. These findings have led researchers to conclude that opportunity structures create and determine future generations' chances for success. Hence, our lot in life is at least partially determined by where we grow up, and this is partially determined by where our parents grew up, and so on. Economic mobility may be affected by factors such as geographic location, education, genetics, culture, race, sex, and interactions among these, as well as family wealth. Famous historical cases. Famous instances of great economic and social mobility include Benjamin Franklin and Henry Ford. Additional popular examples of upward social mobility between generations in America include Abraham Lincoln and Bill Clinton, who were born into working-class families yet achieved high political office in adult life. Andrew Carnegie arrived in the U.S. as a poor immigrant and rose to become a steel tycoon, perhaps the wealthiest man in America, and its leading philanthropist. Comparisons with other countries. Several large studies of mobility in developed countries in recent years have found the U.S. among the lowest in mobility. One study found that of 9 developed countries, the United States and United Kingdom had the lowest intergenerational vertical social mobility, with about half of the advantages of having a parent with a high income passed on to the next generation. The 4 countries with the lowest intergenerational income elasticity, i.e., the highest social mobility, were Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Canada, with less than 20% of advantages of having a high-income parent passed on to the children. Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz contends that Scandinavian countries changed their education systems, social policies and legal frameworks to create societies where there is a higher degree of mobility, that made the countries more into the land of opportunity that America once was. Quote, according to journalist Jason DePaul, at least 5 large studies in recent years have found the United States to be less mobile than comparable nations. A project led by Marcus Janti, an economist at a Swedish university, found that 42% of American men raised in the bottom fifth of incomes stay there as adults. That shows a level of persistent disadvantage much higher than in Denmark and Britain, a country famous for its class constraints. Meanwhile, just 8% of American men at the bottom rose to the top fifth. That compares with 12% of the British and 14% of the Danes. Despite frequent references to the United States as a classless society, about 62% of Americans raised in the top fifth of incomes stay in the top 2/5. According to research by the Economic Mobility Project of the Pew Charitable Trusts. Similarly, 65% born in the bottom fifth stay in the bottom 2/5. In 2012, a graph plotting the relationship between income inequality and intergenerational social mobility in the United States and 12 other developed countries, dubbed the Great Gatsby Curve, showed a clear negative relationship between inequality and social mobility. Countries with low levels of inequality such as Denmark, Norway and Finland had some of the greatest mobility, while the 2 countries with the high level of inequality, Chile and Brazil, had some of the lowest mobility. The curve was introduced in a speech by Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisers Alan Kruger and a President's Economic Report to Congress. Decline. Some studies have found that not only is the degree of social mobility in the U.S. not large, but it has either remained unchanged or decreased since the 1970s. Other research shows that economic mobility in the U.S. increased from 1950 to 1980 but has declined sharply since 1980. The centrist Brookings Institution said in March 2013 that income inequality was increasing and becoming permanent, sharply reducing social mobility. Absolute mobility. Even though mobility has gone down, most Americans still have more income than the parents. A 2007 study, Economic Mobility Project, across generations, using panel study of income dynamics, found 67% of Americans who were children in 1968 had higher levels of real family income in 1995 to 2002 than the parents had in 1967 to 1971 as to whether this figure is higher or lower than other countries is difficult to say, as this type of measure has not been done for other countries. Intragenerational mobility. Another form of mobility Intragenerational is the change in class and/or income experienced by individuals during their lifetime. Intragenerational mobility renders the meaning of short-term inequality ambiguous, since high intragenerational mobility suggests that those who are currently less well-off will move up the class or income scale later in life. How strong intragenerational mobility is in the U.S. is disputed. Supporting relatively high levels of intragenerational mobility, Thomas A. Garrett reported on a U.S. Treasury study of income mobility from 1996 to 2005. This found there was considerable income mobility of individuals in the U.S. economy during the 1996 through 2005 period, as over half of taxpayers moved to a different income quintile over this period. 80% of taxpayers had incomes in quintiles as higher in 2005 than they did in 1996, and 45% of taxpayers not in the highest income quintile moved up at least one quintile. Fewer than half of those in the top 1% in 1996 were still in the top 1% in 2005. Only about 25% of the individuals in the top 1/100th% in 1996 remained in the top 1/100th% in 2005. The study reassured Americans the opportunity for upward mobility in America, despite the concern about the long-term trend of increasing income inequality in the U.S. economy. After-tax income of the top 1% earners has grown by 176% from 1979 to 2007, while it grew only 9% for the lowest 20%. However, others describe the data as reflecting less mobility. A 2007 inequality and mobility study found the pattern of annual and long-term earnings inequality very close, and the population at top income levels in America very stable, and had not mitigated the dramatic increase in annual earnings concentration since the 1970s. A 2011 CBO study on trends in the distribution of household income between 1979 and 2007 also found multi-year household income distribution in America only modestly more equal than annual income. Given the fairly substantial movement of households across income groups over time, it might seem that income measured over a number of years should be significantly more equally distributed than income measured over 1 year. However, much of the movement of households involves changes in income that are large enough to push households into different income groups but not large enough to greatly affect the overall distribution of income. Multi-year income measures also show the same pattern of increasing inequality over time as is observed in annual measures. In other words, many people who have incomes greater than $1 million 1 year fall out of the category the next year, but that's typically because their income fell from, say, $1.05 million to $0.95 million, not because they went back to being middle class. Economist Paul Krugman complains that conservatives have resorted to extraordinary series of attempts at statistical distortion in claiming high levels of mobility. Studies by the Urban Institute and the U.S. Treasury have both found that about half of the families who start in either the top or the bottom quintile of the income distribution are still there after a decade, and that only 3 to 6% rise from bottom to top or fall from top to bottom. While in any given year, some of the people with low incomes will be workers on temporary layoff, small businessmen taking write-offs, farmers hit by bad weather. The rise in their income in succeeding years is not the same mobility as poor people rising to middle class or middle income rising to wealth. It's the mobility of the guy who works in the college bookstore and has a real job by his early 30s. Causes and issues. Explanations for the relatively low level of social mobility in the U.S. include the better access of affluent children to superior schools and preparation for school, so important in an economy where pay is tilted toward educated workers, high levels of immigration of unskilled laborers, and low rate of unionization, which leads to lower wages among the least skilled. Public health problems, like obesity and diabetes, which can limit education and employment. The sheer size of the income gap between the rich, which makes it harder to climb the proverbial income ladder when the rungs are farther apart. Poverty, since those with low income have significantly lower rates of mobility than middle and higher income individuals. The factors which affect social mobility vary across the United States as to social mobility, which in favored areas is much higher than in less favored areas. Education. Multiple reports have found that education promotes economic mobility. The report is Pursuing the American Dream. Economic mobility across generations found that a 4-year college degree promotes upward mobility from the bottom and prevents downward mobility for the middle and top. For instance, having a 4-year college degree makes someone born into the bottom quintile of income 3 times more likely to climb all the way to top as an adult. Wages and earnings correlate with education. A 2009 survey of young adults who worked full-time throughout a full year found the median income of whose without a high school diploma was below the poverty level for a family of 4 and less than half of what whose with a bachelor's degree earned. The difference has worsened since 1979, when the average college graduate made 38% more than the average high school graduate. By 2011, college graduates made 75% more income. Mobility to the class of college graduates has declined. Those born with parents who graduated from college have far better odds of graduating from college than those born to high school graduates. Some scholars have complained about the effect of education on mobility at virtually every level. Education in America tends to perpetuate rather than compensate for existing inequalities. The reasons are threefold. First, the K-12 education system is simply not very strong and thus is not an effective way to break the link between parental background and a child's eventual success. Second, because K-12 education is financed largely at the state and local level, resources devoted to education are closely linked with where people live and with the property wealth of the neighbors. For this and other reasons, poor children tend to go to poor schools and more advantaged children to good schools. Finally, access both to a quality preschool experience and a higher education continues to depend quite directly on family resources. Quote, others have defended educational attainment as also freeing individuals from the constraints of the social origins. Poverty. Comparing the U.S. with one high mobility state, journalist Kevin Drum concluded that lack of mobility for the poorest children in the United States seems to be the primary reason for America's lag behind other developed countries. A study from the Economic Mobility Project found that growing up in a high-poverty neighborhood increases Americans' risk of experiencing downward mobility and explains a sizable portion of the black-white downward mobility gap. The report's analysis also showed that black children who experience a reduction in the neighborhood's poverty rate have greater economic success in adulthood than black children who experience poverty rates that increase or are stable. Gender and Race. Reports analyzing the economic mobility of African Americans compared to that of whites have found stark differences. One report found that 53% of blacks born in the bottom income quintile remain there as adults, while only 33% of whites do. Research has also found that the children of black middle-class families are more likely to fall out of the middle class. Despite the increased presence of blacks and women in the workforce over the years, women and non-whites hold jobs with less rank, authority, opportunity for advancement and pay than men and whites, a glass ceiling being said to prevent them from occupying more than a very small percentage in top managerial positions. One explanation for this is seen in the networks of genders and ethnic groups. The more managers there are in an employee's immediate work environment, the higher the employee's chances of interacting and spending time with high-status, income employees. The more likely these employees are to be drawn on for promotion. As of the 1990s, the vast majority of all clerical and office workers are women, but made up less than half of all managers. Less than 15% of all managers were minorities, while roughly a quarter of all clerical and office employees were. The networks of women and minorities are simply not as strong as those of males and whites, putting them at a disadvantage in status, income mobility. For women, another explanation for this glass ceiling effect in the American workforce is the job-family trade-off. While both men and women feel that a conflict exists between job and family, women with children, particularly married women, are more likely to either temporarily leave the labor force or cut back on employment by using flex time, working part-time a part of the year. Unfortunately, lower mobility results as part-time employment is usually lower-paying employment, with less chance of promotion into a higher-status job, a likelihood of a return to full-time employment for at least a few years. Taking a leave from the workforce tends to decrease human capital when it comes to finding a job. Women are also more likely than men to take leave from their jobs to care for others rather than themselves. Knowing this, employers are wary of hiring and promoting women in the workforce. Others have pointed out that men have statistically been willing to accept job conditions that women were not, such as working outside in extreme weather, working where you can become physically dirty on a regular basis, working more hours, etc. This is based on survey information, and shows that it is difficult to make direct comparisons. Conservatives also question the extent of gender discrimination, arguing that competition between firms would lead them to bid up wages of any group, if they provided the same or better value of work for less pay as employees. Immigration. According to economist George J. Borjas, most immigrants to the U.S. are at a sizable earning disadvantage compared to native-born workers, and the earnings of different groups of immigrants vary widely. Borjas found that intergenerational upward economic mobility, averaging a 5% to 10% in increase in income from the first to the second generation of immigrants, although there was wide variation among ethnic groups. Other research suggests that length of time resided in the U.S. narrows the occupational gap between Hispanic immigrants and non-Hispanic whites and U.S.-born Hispanic counterparts. Overcoming language barriers and adjusting to the new environment and culture to American society creates barriers for new immigrants, and there is significant economic catching up between the first and second generations. This intergenerational mobility includes poor as well as middle-income groups, although among the high-income Borjas noted a regression towards the mean or equalizing tendency in income status, whereby children of very successful immigrants tended to have lower, not higher, incomes status than the parents, becoming successful but not as successful. Impact of incarceration. According to some researchers, America's high incarceration rate and war on drugs policies have created an underclass with severely limited social mobility. Within the United States, the prison population has been steadily increasing since the early 1970s and has now surpassed 2 million, making it the highest per capita rate in the world. This boom has been fueled to a large extent by the war on drugs starting in the 1980s. In addition to the mobility handicaps of imprisonment, this war has effectively created a poor, mobile class by denying one of the most important tools for social mobility, education. In a number of ways, the drug war has combined with public school zero-tolerance policies to remove tens of thousands of adolescents from the public schools. Denial of higher education has been adopted as an additional punishment for drug offenders. The war on drugs siphons drug users out of society and into prison. The lack of education for convicted felons is compounded with difficulties in finding employment. These two factors contribute towards a high recidivism rate and downward social mobility. Tax expenditures. Partial exemption of the poor from taxation through reliance on progressive income taxes rather than sales taxes for revenue or tax rebates such as the earned income tax credit loosely correlate with income mobility, with areas which tax the poor heavily such as the Deep South showing low mobility. Other factors. Significant correlations have been found between intergenerational mobility and economic inequality, economic and racial residential segregation, measures of K-12 school quality, social capital indices, and measures of family structure or history of study. Sociologists Blau and Duncan collected mobility data along with the U.S. Bureau of the Census in 1962. The data included information on occupational family backgrounds. In 1962, 56.8% of sons with fathers who had occupations in upper non-manual ended up with occupations in the same level. Only 1.2% of sons with fathers who had farming occupations ended up in upper non-manual occupations. In 1973, these differences increased. 59.4% of sons with fathers in upper non-manual occupations achieved occupations of the same level, and 0.9% of sons with fathers in farming occupations ended up in upper non-manual occupations. However, the occupational structure is more rigid towards the top and bottom. Those in lower non-manual occupations and upper and lower manual occupations were more likely to be vertically mobile. Upper non-manual occupations have the highest level of occupational inheritance. In the 1980s, studies found that only 20% of the income gap persisted between generations in America, according to the Christian Science Monitor. However, by 2003, improvements in econometrics showed that poverty could endure over several generations.